Hi, I'm Adam. Welcome back to Godot Game Lab. In this episode, we'll add the whole shop UI, which you can see on the right-hand side here. So let's see what we're working with. So for example, if I drag around this unit and set it to the sell portal, you'll see that this gold value I currently have immediately updates. So we have this one. Then we can also buy units. You can hover over them. You can see how much they cost, what traits they have, and so on. If I click on one, we don't spawn the unit yet. So it's not fully functional. This will be a topic of the next episode. But if I take a look at this console message, you see that we do recognize this, right? So we bought one unit, it's called Arthur, and our gold became 50 after buying the unit. We can also buy XP. So we have this XP tracker here, which shows that we are currently sitting at level 1 and we need 2 XP to level up. So we need 2 XP for level 3 as well. So when I buy one batch of XP, which is 4 gold, I get 4 XP and I immediately level up 2 times and the gold gets subtracted. When I keep buying XP, we have this progress bar, which shows us our progression in the current level, and these requirements keep becoming bigger and bigger. One thing I can also do is I can re-roll for new units, and this costs us 2 gold, which gets subtracted when I click on it. You'll see I went from 18 to 16, but we don't have the re-rolling mechanic yet, but we do have a debug message saying that we should re-roll the units into new ones. So the actual re-rolling unit pools and spawning the units we bought will be a topic for the next video, but the UI itself is still working like that. So if I reroll once, you'll see that I go down to 2 gold and the XP button and the unit buying buttons will be disabled because I can no longer afford that much. And if I reroll one more time, this button will be disabled as well. Without further ado, let's see how we can build this UI. Let's talk about the architecture first. So in this episode, we'll add the first piece of UI to the game, namely the shop. So the shop UI is responsible for buying units and XP, re-rolling units into new ones, and also showing the gold, the level, and the XP requirement to progress to the next level. So how does this work? What system do we need to connect to? So in terms of connections, we have to signal to the arena to the highest level when we buy a unit. So the arena can connect the shop and the unit spawner together to spawn new units when we buy them from the shop. The shop itself will be split into multiple different self-contained pieces of UI, namely the gold display, which shows the current amount of gold we have, the XP tracker, which is in the bottom right corner, a collection of unit cards, which are on the right side of the UI, and the 2 buttons we can use for rerolling and buying XP. But in order for this UI to work properly, we also need to have access to a resource called PlayerStats. For this episode, this resource will be pretty simple. It will hold the current amount of XP and gold the player has. Let's break down the UI a bit further. At the highest level, we have the full shop UI, which will be a simple control node, but you can see that it's split into 2 different containers. So this split happens on the vertical axis, so we'll use a VBox container to split the space into 2. Then if we take a look at the upper half, these nodes or UI pieces are split on the horizontal axis, so we'll use an HBox container for the gold display and the collection of unit cards. Then the unit cards themselves are also split in a vertical way, so we'll use a VBox container to separate them. For the lower part, the first split we make will be a horizontal one, so we'll use an HBox container to separate the XP buying button and the other half. This other half will be split into 2 vertically, so we'll use a VBox container to display them. And that's about it. That's how we can break down this UI into smaller parts. So with the project open here, let's start by creating a new scene for the shop UI. Click on the plus sign here to create a new scene, and for the shop, we'll use a control node. So let's click on user interface, double click to rename this, and we can call this shop or something like that. Let's not forget to save the scene with Ctrl S. And in the scenes folder, I'll just create a new one by clicking on this icon here, and let's just call it shop as well. And shop.tscn is perfectly fine for the scene name, so let's just click on save. So the shop itself definitely doesn't need to be this big. Let's anchor it to the top right corner of the screen because that's where it belongs. So let's click on the anchor presets button here. and anchor it to the top right corner of the screen. Now we just need to create the hierarchy we saw in the architecture overview. So with the shop node, the root node selected, click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A. And first we split this shop UI half with a VBox container on the vertical axis. So let's add the VBox container child. Then we'll have the upper half and the bottom half, and both of those will be split into two on the horizontal axis. So with the VBox container selected, press Ctrl A again and add an HBox container. This will be the top half with the gold display and the unit cards, and duplicate this by pressing Ctrl D. And this will be the bottom half with the XP button and the reroll and XPTracker pieces. So let's rename a couple of things to make this UI a bit nicer. Double click on the first HBox container and we can call it something like top, and the other one the bottom part. And actually I'm not 100% sure that we need this control node at all. The shop itself can be a VBox container because we don't really need this as a separate one. So I just changed my mind here a bit, but that's not a problem because if we select this node and right click on it, we have this button called Make Scene Root. So if we click on this one, then the VBox container will be the root node. We can delete the shop node we had by pressing delete, and just rename this to a shop instead, like so. But the anchoring is reset, so click on the anchor presets again, and let's make sure that it sticks to the top right corner of the screen. So we have one less node this way. And now we can actually start creating the individual UI pieces. So we'll do everything separately, then instantiate them back in this shop UI. So we can test them properly in isolation, but then we can sort of compose the whole shop UI together. Let's start with the gold display. Again, we'll create a new scene. So click on the plus sign here. And this time for the gold display, we'll have a number and an icon next to each other on the horizontal axis. So the root node will be an HBox container, and we can instantly double click and rename this to gold display or something like that. And we want to add two child nodes to this gold display HBox container. So let's click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A. The first one will be a label, and the second one with the gold display root node selected again, press Ctrl A, will be for the icon a texture rect node. And we can rename those as well. Instead of label, we can just say something like gold. Instead of the texture rect, we can say something like icon. Okay, so now that we have the icon selected, we can actually set this up. So we have an icon for the gold in our assets folder. We can either browse it here, or we can click on the arrow next to the texture, click on quick load and search for gold.png. And now we have this gold icon, but you can see it's screwed up because by default it scales. So we'll just set the stretch mode to keep us back centered and the expand mode to ignore size, so we can set it to whatever we want it to. And under control and layout, we can set a custom minimum size and we'll set it to 10 pixels on the X. So it looks like this. We'll see if that's big enough or not. For now, it's fine. And under transform, you'll see that we cannot change the size. It will be 40 pixels by default because it's a child of a container node. So the size is determined by this HBox container, but we really don't need it to be 40 pixels tall, but we'll change this from the gold display node itself when we are finished. Okay, so now onto the label. If we type in something like 99, we definitely won't have more gold than 99, so it's a good testing value. And it looks fine. It uses the font we set up, but we can definitely tweak this a bit. To make it more readable and a bit more interesting, we can add a shadow to this. With the label settings, resource selected, click on this arrow next to empty and create a new label settings resource. And under font, 16 pixels and the white color is fine, but if we expand the shadow, we can set the shadow color to a fully black color, and we can set the size to 2 pixels maybe. And we don't see the change because I forgot to crank up the alpha value. So the alpha is set to 0, but if we start to crank this up, then you'll see the shadow appearing. I kind of like how this looks. So our gold display is practically done, but we can reset the height and the width of this UI piece. So if we select the gold display, the root node, and under layout, go to transform, and we have this arrow next to the size, so it won't be 40 by 40 pixels. Instead, it will be the minimum, which contains both children. And I think that's perfectly fine. So that's all we need from the editor side. But before we jump into scripting, let's not forget to actually save this scene. So press Ctrl S, go back one folder, And under scenes, we can create a new folder again with this icon. I'll just call it GoldDisplay, and GoldDisplay.tscn is perfectly fine. Click on save, and now we have our scene saved. Now on to the scripting part. So select the root node, the GoldDisplay node, click on the attach script button, and we'll add GoldDisplay.gd to this node. And we don't really want to use any templates, so we can just click on create and see how we can do this. Fortunately for us, this script is really simple. So first of all, we'll provide a custom class name called GoldDisplay. Then we'll have an export variable for our PlayerStats resource. So we have access to the current amount of gold the player has. Then we'll grab an already variable reference to the gold label we just created. And inside our ready callback, we'll grab the PlayerStats resource and connect its changed signal to our own callback function called onPlayerStatsChanged. And we'll also call the same callback method manually to make sure that when this node is ready in the scene tree, the gold immediately updates. And inside this callback method, what we do is we set the gold label text property to the amount of gold the player has according to the PlayerStats resource, but converting it to a string to make sure that we can assign it as the text property. And that's all we really need. We can save this with Ctrl S, and with the script done, let's test if it works or not. So let's go back to 2D view, and you'll see that we have this PlayerStats resource, which is empty right here. So if we go to the file system and search for PlayerStats, we'll have this PlayerStats TRES here. But it should also work with quick load as well. So if we click on the arrow here and press quick load, you'll see that we have the same resource available. Click on open or press enter, and now the PlayerStats resource is assigned to this. So now if we save the scene and run the scene by clicking on this icon or pressing F6, you'll see that from 99 it updates to 50 when we run the game, which definitely works because if I click on this PlayerStats resource, it's set to 50. Awesome. If we want to test it to see if it updates or not when the resource actually changes, we can go back to the script tab and do something like PlayerStats.gold minus equals 7, for example. And if we run the scene again, it will be 43. We don't even see the 50, but that doesn't mean it wasn't 50 to begin with. It's just that the code runs so fast that by the time we display the 50, we immediately subtract this 7, and this is the one we see. Okay, so it definitely updates when the changed signal is emitted, so we can delete this testing code here, save the script again. And now we move on to the big gun. We'll do the unit card next, which is probably the most complicated piece of UI in this shop. So to do this, let's go back to 2D view and click on the plus sign again to create a new scene. And since we want our whole unit card to be a clickable thing, we'll use a button as our base. So let's click on other node and search for button. Let's double click and rename this to UnitCard or something like that. Let's zoom in a bit and see how we can build this up. So the first thing we want to add is a color rectangle, which will be sort of the backdrop where we have the sprite of the unit and the traits. So whether it's a Viking, a mage, or whatever. So with the unit card, the root node selected, press Ctrl A and search for color rectangle. And we can double click and rename this to something like backdrop. And before we set this up, we want to make sure that we use the right size for the button so we can set the anchors accordingly. So let's select the root node, the unit card node. And what I used in this example under layout for the minimum size is 80 pixels on the horizontal axis and 52 pixels on the vertical axis. And now you'll see that this is the size we'll use for the button. And we can make the backdrop anchoring preset to be full rect so it fills the whole thing. And we can set the color to whatever we like. I'll just use this very dark, deep bluish color for the backdrop. And one thing we really need to be aware of is the mouse filtering properties, okay? Because we only want this unit card to pick up the mouse clicks, so we can use the pressed signal for the button to notify our arena and the unit spawner that we bought a unit. So with the backdrop selected, let's go to mouse, and you'll see it's set to stop by default, meaning that this would consume the mouse events instead of the button. So make sure to set this to ignore, and this is really important because otherwise the buying won't work. Okay, so for this backdrop, we also want the traits to be displayed inside of it. So with the backdrop selected, add another child node by pressing Ctrl A or clicking on the plus sign and searching for label. click on create and rename this to traits. Okay, so this is where we'll set the traits data, or display the traits data rather. We want this to be easily accessible in our code, so let's right click on it and access it as a scene unique name to make sure that it's easy to access this when we code the whole unit card, regardless of where it lies in the node hierarchy. Okay, so let's set up some testing text. Let's say it will be a Viking and a fighter or something like that. This font is way too big for this, right? So let's click on our label settings resource and create a new one. And the first thing we can set is the line spacing. So we can set this to 0 so the two lines are closer together. And also we can use a different font for this. So if we press quick load, we basically have 3 fonts in the project, and this M5X7 is a really small font, which is perfect for this one. So let's double click on this and you'll instantly see the difference. Right, so another thing we can also set is the color of the font, because I don't want this to be this prominent. This white color is way too prominent, I think. So in my example, I've used this semi-transparent light blue color, this one, and I think it looks pretty nice. And we also need to move this label a bit away from the edges, because we'll also have a border connected to this whole thing, right? So make sure that we turn off the grid snapping and go into move mode by pressing W, and we can move it around however we want it to. Something like this maybe. I think it looks kind of okay. So I go back to selection mode by pressing Q, and we're done with the traits part. So we can move on to the next one, which will be the bottom part of the whole unit card, this one, where we have 2 things or 3 things. We have the gold cost, we have the name of the unit, and we also have a colored panel background based on the rarity this unit has. Let's select the unit card, the root node. Click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A and search for panel. So we'll use a simple panel for this. Add it as a child node, double click and rename this to something like bottom. And we also want to have access to this in the code, because we want to change the color according to the unit data this card will have. So let's right click on it and access it as a scene unique name. Again, we need to make sure that we cannot click on it. So before we do anything else, go to mouse, filter, and set it to ignore. Okay, this is super important. Okay, so now that we're done with this, we can set the anchor preset for this node. Click on the anchor presets, and we can use the bottom wide preset this time. So it stretches to the whole width of its parent, and we only need to set the height. And to do this, we can go to layout, and for a custom minimum size on the Y, we can just set it to 18 pixels or something like that. And we need to set the color of this. So this will be dynamic based on the unit resource we have, but to kind of get a look and feel what this works like inside the game, we can set it to something else. So let's go to theme overrides, styles, and add a new flat style box to this one, and you'll immediately see the color change. Click on this new resource and set the background color property to a different one. And I'll just use this vibrant dark green color for now, and it looks much better already. So what do we have inside this bottom panel? First of all, to make sure that we have some space between the content of this bottom part and the edges, we'll add a margin container. So with the bottom panel node selected, click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A and search for margin container. And this margin container can fill the whole thing. So in the anchor presets, let's set it to full rect, and this will make sure that it snaps to all the corners to its parent. Again, we need to make sure that we cannot click on this. So let's go to mouse, and it's set to pass, which is not a problem, but to make sure that it works, we can set it to ignore just to be 100% sure. And then we can set the margins. So let's go to theme overrides and constants, and we'll have the 4 margin values available. In this case, I'll just use 4 pixels on the left side and 5 pixels on the right side, but we can revisit this when we actually have the content added. Inside this margin container, we'll have the name of the unit and the amount of gold it costs. So what we can do is we can add a new HBox container, because these will be next to each other. So with the margin container selected, click on the plus sign or press Ctrl A and search for HBox container, and you'll see that these margins do work, because the size of this HBox container will be a lot smaller than the whole thing. Right? We can just call this an HBox container, and with this one selected, press Ctrl A again, add a new label for the unit's name, double click and rename this to unit name or something like that. And you'll see, again, this is something that we want to be able to change from code, right? So let's right click on it and access it as a scene unique name. And we can type in something like author as a testing name. Something I already forgot to do is for the HBox container, again, double check the mouse filtering, set it to ignore. Okay. So now we have the unit name, and I don't really think we need to change anything, but you can adjust however you want it to. But we do need to add the gold display, right, to see how much gold the unit costs. So with the HBox container selected, press Ctrl A again, and we'll add an HBox container again because we want to display the number and the gold icon next to each other. So we'll use an HBox container for that one. And we can double click and call this something like gold container or something like that. And one thing you might ask is, why don't we just reuse the gold display we created? Well, see, the problem with that is that the gold display scene we created is only useful for displaying the amount of gold the player has, right? Because it relies on the player stats resource. In theory, we could have made it so the gold display is not relying on the player stats resource to work, so it's more generic and we could reuse it here. But realistically speaking, those are the only two places you want to display gold, so it's not a big deal to create an HBox container and add the icon and the cost. But if you want to like maximize the reusability of your UI pieces, then you could have made it more generic. But another problem, and the reason why I didn't do it, is if we click back to the gold display, you'll see here the order of the nodes is the label first and the gold icon next to it. But actually in the unit card, I want to do it the other way. So making it independent from the player stats resource and making it flexible so I can, I don't know, use a checkbox to decide what I want to display first is a bit over engineering in this case. And I want to emphasize that I really like good code and architecture, but sometimes over engineering things is just a way to complicate development and also to sort of sabotage yourself from making real progress and doing minuscule stuff like that, right? So we can just redo this by pressing Ctrl A, adding a texture rect first this time, double click on it, rename it to gold icon, select the gold container again, press Ctrl A, add a new label node, set it to something like gold cost. And this is the one we actually want to set from code, right? Not the icon. It doesn't change. So right click on it, access it as a scene unique name. So you'll see that we start to accumulate a lot of nodes that we want to manipulate from code, right? So to test, the gold cost can be something like 1. And for the icon, again, we can just quick load our gold.png image, set the stretch mode to keep aspect centered, the expand mode to ignore size, and we can set it to, you know what, the original size is fine. So we can just say keep size with this one. And you'll see that it looks a bit off. So I actually want those two to be closer together. So if we select our gold container and go to theme overrides and constants, we can set the separation to 0, but 0 is a bit too close, right? So let's set it to 2 or 3, maybe. I kind of like it with 2. So they are closer together. And it would be nice if this would appear at the end of this whole HBox container, right? So one thing we can do is with the gold container selected, go to layout and container sizing and set the horizontal expand property to true. And what this does is that this gold container will fill all the available horizontal space inside that HBox container. So now it looks a lot better and we have more space, but in order for move this space over here, what we can do is we can set the alignment to end. So both of these elements or these children will snap towards the end of the container and we got a bit of a breathing space here. Okay, cool. One final thing we need to do with this bottom part is to make sure that the gold icon cannot pick up mouse signals. So let's go to mouse and set the filter property from pass to ignore to make sure that we cannot click on this at all. Okay. There's not much more, I promise. So let's select the UnitCard node again because this bottom part is basically done, and press Ctrl A to add a new child node, and this time we'll add a panel again to create this bordering effect around the whole thing. So to make sure that it covers the whole thing, set the anchor preset to full rect, double click on the panel and rename it to border or something like that. Again, this will be dynamic because we want to change the color based on the unit data. So right click on it and access it as a scene unique name. And now what we want to do is we want to go to theme overrides, styles, and create a new stylebox flat again. But you'll see we immediately cover up the whole thing. So let's click on that resource. And for the background color, it doesn't really matter what we use. We want it to be fully transparent. So what matters is we crank down the alpha to 0. And what we want to do is we want to go to border width and set the border to something we like. I'll use 2 pixels on each side. And for the border color, we want to use the same color we use for the bottom panel, so it looks like they belong together. So let's click on color, and under recent colors, I'll probably have this bright vibrant green, and you'll see it immediately adds this nice little border effect to the whole thing. And that's basically it for the border. We only have 2 more nodes to go before we can wrap this up. So select the UnitCard node again, and what's missing is the image of our hero, right, or our unit. So with the root node selected, press Ctrl A to add a new child node and search for texture rect because we just want to use an image for this. Double click and rename this to unit icon or something like that. And to test this, we can use whichever hero we want to use. But if you remember, all these units are inside one image. So this time we want to create a new Atlas texture, and if we click on this Atlas texture, the Atlas property is empty, so click on this arrow and quick load, and we can search for rogues.png because that's the image we want, as you see. And now we don't want to display all of them right at once. So what we can do is we can click on edit region, and you'll see this familiar screen where we can pick one. I don't know, to test this, we can just use our default guy here and click on close, and you see that we have our image. Now we just want to move it to its place. So in this case, I can anchor it maybe to the center top of the whole thing. And we can just go into move mode by pressing W and try to move it to its place. But you see, he's way too big. And that's because the Atlas texture selects this 32 by 32 image, but it's set to scale and keep size. So instead, what we can do is we can set it to keep aspect centered and ignore size, and set the size property inside layout to 32 by 32 because that's the size we wanted to use. And now we can fit our guy to this card however we want it to. I kind of like that, it looks nice. So I can just go back to selection mode by pressing Q, and we have our unit icon. Again, we need to make sure that we cannot click on this. So under Control and mouse, we can set the filter to ignore. Did we do this with the border? I don't remember. So let's go back and double check. I forgot it, right? So the border node is still set to filter stop, and we want this to ignore all the clicks. So basically we want everything to ignore the clicks, so we can only click on the button. And one final thing we need to do is a bit of an odd one, and I'll show you why we need this when we test it, but let me just really quickly explain. When we have multiple unit cards, they will be put inside VBox containers, right? So they will be under each other. But when we buy a unit, we want to delete that card basically, right? Well, yes, but when we delete it, see, all the other units would jump up because the VBox container sort of redraws all its children under each other. And we don't really want that because that would feel really clunky with the UI. If I bought a unit which is the first one and I want to buy the second one real quick, I can misclick because as I buy the first one, all the other ones under would jump up one position, and we definitely don't want that. So instead what we do is we create an empty placeholder when we buy a unit, which will be displayed on top of everything to make sure that everything stays in its place. So if we select our unit card, the root node, and press Ctrl A one last time, we'll add a panel for this, and this panel will cover up the whole thing. So with the anchor presets, we can set it to full rect, and this is the only one where we actually want to have the mouse filtering set to stop to make sure that when this panel displays, then we cannot click on the unit by it anymore. So this will prevent the whole thing from jumping up and down, and also will prevent us from buying the same unit multiple times. So let's double click on it first and call it something like empty placeholder. And again, this will be something we need to access inside our code easily. So right click on it and access it as a same unique name. But I also forgot to do this for the icon. So let's click on the icon and make sure that we can access that too, as it's dynamic. Okay, so for the empty placeholder, we don't really want to see anything related to the unit when we actually bought one. So what we can do for this panel is to go to Theme Overrides and Styles and create a new flat box. And this can be whatever you like. I just use a fully black rectangle this time. So when we buy a unit, the whole thing we'll see is this, right? And since it consumes the clicks, we cannot buy a unit anymore, but this also makes sure that the VBucks container containing all the unit cards won't reorder its children. Phew, okay. That was a bit of a long one. We can hide this empty placeholder by default because this will only be visible when we actually buy a unit. So now one thing we cannot forget with this amount of progress is actually saving the scene before we continue forward. So let's press Ctrl S, go back one folder, create a new folder by clicking on this icon, and we'll create a folder called UnitCard, and UnitCard.tscn is perfectly fine. Click on save, and let's see how we can make this live by adding some code to it. Okay, now let's see how we can actually make this come alive by adding some code to it. So let's select our UnitCard root node, click on the Attach Script button, and click on Create. And before we jump into coding and explaining it, we need to connect some signals. So with the UnitCard node, the root node selected, let's go to Node and Signals, and we'll connect 3 signals to this one. First, the pressed signal, so let's double click on it, click on Connect, and we'll also want to use the mouse entered and mouse exited signals. So let's double click on those as well, and connect them to this script. Okay, so let's see what we need to do here. First of all, we'll provide a custom class name called UnitCard. Then, to make sure that we can establish a connection between the unit spawner and buying units in the UI, we'll emit a signal when we click on a unit and we buy it, called UnitBought, and we pass the unit stats resource as a parameter. We'll also have a constant called hover border color, which is a color I just picked that I like. So this will be the color used when we hover over a unit card. Then we'll have 2 export variables, one for the player stats resource, so we can know if we have enough gold to buy a unit or not. And one will be to a unit stats resource, which we use to sort of set all the properties, the colors, the text, the icon, and everything else. So it's pretty important that we have access to the unit stats resource. And whenever we change it, we also want to update everything related to this UI piece, right? So we'll have a custom setter function which does exactly that. Then we have a lot of on-ready variable references, and I mean a lot. Make sure that when you follow along, you don't just type all this, right? Remember, you can drag and drop from the scene tree, right? But we also have 2 extra on-ready variable references, namely these bottom 2. So what we do is we grab those style box flat resources we created in the inspector for the border and the bottom panel. And the reason why is because we want to change their color property, their background color property, or the border color property based on what unit we currently have when we change the unit stats, right? So we need to have access to those. We just set this green color to see how it looks like, but it won't be always green. So we need to have access to those style boxes. And we'll also have 2 member variables. One is to keep track of whether we already bought the unit or not, because remember, when we bought it, we need to show that black rectangle and make sure to disable the button so we cannot buy the unit again. And one for the border color to make sure that we can restore the original border color, because when we hover over the card, we change it to the hover color, but when the mouse exits the unit card, we need to change it back to the original one. So that's why we need to store the original border color as well. Right. So what about these methods? First of all, we'll see what we need to do inside Ready. One of the big things we need to do inside Ready is to connect to the player stats resources changed signal and call our callback method. This is basically the same thing we did with the GoldDisplay, right? We need to call this immediately inside Ready too, to make sure that if we don't have enough gold as the player to buy a unit, it disables the unit card from buying. And just to test how this works, we can add some testing code as well. So we connect to our own signal when we buy a unit, and I just wanted to print out some information to the console so we can test if buying a unit works or not. So we can test this in isolation. We don't really have to connect to the unit spawner yet, right? So that's it for the Ready callback. What about the other ones? Probably the biggest one is the setter function when we change to a new unit stats resource. So the first thing we do is we update that property based on the new value. And then since this is an export variable, it might happen that the node is not ready in the scene tree if we assign a testing unit stats resource to this scene and we run it that way. We need to wait for the node to be ready inside the scene tree. If for whatever reason we don't have a valid unit stats resource, we can show the empty placeholder, disable the button, and set the bot property to true to make sure that if we don't have a valid unit stats resource, we cannot click on it and nothing happens when we do. But the interesting part is when we do have a valid unit stats resource. First of all, we can now decide the border color of that unit stats resource because we have this rarity colors dictionary inside our unit stats. So if you don't remember, I just press and hold Control and click on it. Inside our unit stats resource, we have an enum for the rarities. We have 4, and we have a dictionary for the rarity colors where the keys are the rarities themselves and the values are colors assigned to them. So we can rely on this combination of the enum and this dictionary to grab the color which belongs to that unit, right? And now that we have our current border color property set, we can update the two style boxes. So for the border style box, we want to change the border color property, but for the bottom style box, we want to use the background color. We set those two, we change the two labels. For the name, we'll use the name property of the unit stats resource. For the gold cost, we'll convert the integer gold cost value to a string and use that one. And we can also update the icon. And since we use an atlas texture, we need to update the region's position based on the skin coordinates of the unit stats multiplied by the arena cell size, right? Because all cells are 32 by 32 and the images of the units are 32 by 32 as well, right? So that's the longest bit of code we need to do probably. So we update basically everything that needs to be updated in this UI when we change the unit stats to a new one. What about when the player stats change? So for example, the amount of gold we have changes. First of all, if we don't have a unit stats resource, we don't really want to do anything. But if we do, we have to decide if we have enough gold or not to buy that specific unit. So I just created a Boolean variable here called has enough gold, and the value will be the answer to the question if the amount of gold the player has is greater than or equal to the gold cost of the unit. And we can set the button's disabled property to the opposite of that, right? Because if we have enough gold, then the button doesn't need to be disabled. But when we don't have enough gold, the disabled needs to be true, so we cannot click on it and buy it. But that's just sort of the logic of picking up the mouse signal. We also want to indicate this visually as well. 2 cases or 3 cases can happen here. If we already bought the unit, the empty placeholder will show. So we want this unit card to be fully opaque. When we have enough gold to buy the unit, the same thing, we want the whole script to be fully opaque. That's why we use this color, right? For the modulate property, fully white, fully opaque. But if we didn't buy the unit and we don't have enough gold, then we can set it to a more transparent color, indicating that we cannot click on that button, right? So this is the visual counterpart to that disabled property. What about when we press the button and want to buy the unit? So if we already bought the unit and for whatever reason we pick up the signal, then we can return from the function immediately because we don't want anything to happen. We cannot buy a unit twice with the same unit card. If we haven't though, then we set the bot property to true, show the empty placeholder, subtract the gold from the player, and emit the unit bot signal. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? Now we only have 2 more methods when we enter with the mouse, and basically what we want to do is to check if it's a safety check first, because we don't want this hover border color to show when the button is actually disabled. But if it's not disabled, then we want to change the border style box's border color to this hover color constant we provided up top. And when we exit the mouse from the button, it doesn't really matter if it's disabled or not. We can set back the border color property to the original border color we have. And that's it. I hope it wasn't too bad. It's just long because we have a lot of things to change when we actually assign a new unit and a lot of already variable references. Let's save the script with Control S and test this, right? So let's go back to 2D view, and with the unit card, the root node selected, let's go back to the inspector tab. And if we scroll all the way up, you'll see that the player stats and the unit stats export variable slots are both empty. So we can just press quick load, assign the player stats, For the unit stats, press quick load again, and we can assign whoever we want to. Let's just test with Arthur first. Okay, so let's save the scene with Control S and run the scene by pressing F6. Okay, cool. So you'll see that everything updated accordingly, except the traits, but we don't have the trait system yet. And if I hover over with the mouse, you'll see that we changed to this hover color. And if I exit the mouse, it changes back. So what happens if I click on it? If I click on it, then we get the unit bought signal emitted. It says that we bought Arthur, and the amount of gold we have is 46 because it cost us 4 gold. Everything seems to work fine, but we do have a small issue here. Why do we have this gray border around our black box, right? It looks weird. But what we can test for sure is that when I click on this black rectangle, nothing happens, right? No more messages. I cannot really buy the same unit twice. So that's fine. But we do have this weird little gray thing. And the reason why is because we have the button, and this button has some style boxes attached to it because of the theme, right? So what can we do about this? If we go to theme overrides and styles, we have a bunch of different style boxes we can use for the different button states. So we can either figure out which one is this, or what we can also do is we can make sure that this button cannot be focused, because it goes to this focus state when we click on it. It makes no sense that we can focus on this button because we can actually only click on it twice, right? So if we go to focus, you'll see that we have this property to set the next neighbors and the previous ones if you want to control a menu with keys or with a controller, for example. But all we need to care about right now is the focus mode. So if I hover over this, you'll see the focus access mode for the control node, none, click, or all. Only one control can be focused at the same time, and it will receive keyboard, gamepad, and mouse signals. So if we set it to none, then it says that this node cannot grab focus, and this is exactly what we want. So if we set this to none, save the scene and run it again to see how it looks like. Now, if we click on it, you'll see that this gray border doesn't appear. And it's not because we assigned a different stylebox property to it or a different theme variation or override. It's just because we said that, okay, this button cannot really be focused. So this solves our problem, right? So this is probably the biggest one, but we got the UnitCard done. Let's see what comes next. If you like my content, please consider checking out my Ko-fi page where you can donate one time or become a member and get early access to all my content and videos. So we'll do the reroll button next. Let's click on the plus sign again to create a new scene. And we'll use another node. Since it's a button, it makes sense that the root node will be a button too, right? Let's double click and rename this to reroll button, and we want to display a bunch of stuff inside that reroll button, so we cannot really rely on the basic button which supports a text and an icon, because we want to use multiple icons for this one. So we can just use a custom format like we did with the UnitCard. As for this button itself, we can set the size though to make sure that we use the size we want. So let's go to layout and set the custom minimum size to 80 by 24, so it's big enough. And then we can start adding our custom children to this. So we want to display a text and two icons next to each other, so we'll use an HBox container for this. So with the reroll button selected, press Ctrl A, search for HBox container, and we can set the default anchoring to make sure that it fills the whole thing. So let's click on the anchor presets and set it to full rect. And inside that HBox container, when we select it and press Ctrl A again, we want to add a couple of things. First of all, a label to display the text we want. And we just want to type reroll. And we can also say 2 because it costs 2 gold to reroll in this case. And this text doesn't really fit for this one. I think we can use the smaller font. So again, we can add the custom label settings for this one. And for the font, we'll quick load our M5 by 7 font, which looks much nicer for this, I think. And to make sure that it pops up a bit, we can use a shadow again if we want to, and I kind of want to, so I just use a black shadow again. And we can make it pop even more by using 2 pixels of a shadow. Yeah, I kind of like how that looks like. And then we can add the 2 icons. So let's select the HBox container again, press Ctrl A and search for texture rect. For the texture, we can quick load our gold.png, set the stretch mode to keep aspect centered, and we can duplicate this by pressing Ctrl D. And for this one, we can quick load another one, and this time we'll have refresh.png, which looks like this. And I don't really want to change anything else. What we can do is we can center the whole thing. So for the HBox container, the alignment property should be set to center so it looks a bit nicer. And we don't really want to change anything else, but we can use better names for our nodes, I think. So let's just rename them. Instead of label, we can use something like text. Instead of texture rect, we can say gold icon. And instead of texture rect 2, we can use something like reroll icon or something like that. Right. Also, we don't want to click on any of these. We only want to pick up the mouse signals with the button. So another way to do this, we did this one by one with the unit card, but to show you a better way, if I select the reroll icon, press and hold shift and click on the HBox container, it selects all these nodes. And since they are all control nodes, we can set their mouse filtered property at the same time. So let's click on mouse and set it to ignore. And now if I select them one by one, you'll see that all of those will be set to ignore, even the label and the HBox container, right? So we can set this one time, but this default button doesn't really look nice because it uses the themes button, which is fine, but for the shop itself, I have some separate style boxes prepared. So if we go to this file system doc here and go to assets and theme, you'll see that I have these 3 different resources for the shop buttons: hover, normal, and pressed states. So we can just use those to spice up this button a bit. So let's go to theme overrides, constants. Oh, what am I doing? This is the HBox container. Okay, so let's go and select the reroll button, collapse everything. And if we go to theme overrides and styles, now we have what we want. And so we want to override the normal, the pressed, and the hover versions. So we can either use quick load, but since I already shown you the file system doc, I can just drag and drop them over. Normal for the normal, and the pressed for the pressed. Again, if we don't change the focus state, then we'll have this weirdly looking default gray border and shadow when we focus a button. I'm not sure if we want to focus at all for this game. I don't think so. So again, what we could do is we could set the focus mode to none, but I'll show you the other way. If you want to use an alternative method, what we can do is we can select the focus style box and set it to a style box empty. So basically a style box empty is not something you can mess around a lot with. It's just an empty style box, right? So this will override the default gray shadow version, right? So with these changes, the button looks much nicer. Let's not forget to actually save it. So press Ctrl S, go up one folder, create a new one. Let's call it Reroll Button and save it as rerollbutton.tscn. And now we just need to hook this up with a script. Let's go ahead and create that script. So with the reroll button node, the root node selected, click on the attach script icon, reroll button.gd is perfectly fine. Press create, and let's see how we do this. And before we jump into it, we need to connect one signal from the button. You guessed it, the pressed signal. So let's select the reroll button, go to node, and double click on the pressed signal to connect it to the script. Then we can provide a custom class name called reroll button. We need one export variable for this to work, a reference to the PlayerStats resource. Again, because it might happen that we only have 1 or 0 gold and then we cannot reroll, right? And we'll also have an already variable reference to the HBox container just to make sure that we can set the modulate property if we cannot click on the button. Inside the ready callback, we do the usual by now. So we grab the PlayerStats resources changed signal and connect our own callback method to it and instantly call it to make sure that we update this button UI accordingly. Inside this callback method, what we do is we create a Boolean variable to see if we have enough gold to reroll once or not. This is just a relatively simple check. We grab the gold property from the PlayerStats resource to see if it's greater than or equal to 2. And we set the button's disabled property accordingly, right? Again, we use the same logic we used with the unit cards. If we have enough gold to reroll once, we set the HBox container modulate properties alpha value to 100%, but if we don't, we set it to the semi-transparent. That's it for this callback method, and when we press the button, what we do in this case is just subtract 2 gold from the player. Well, you might ask that why? Why don't we do the reroll thing? That's what the button's for, right? Well, yes, but I don't really think it's the button's responsibility to handle rerolling. We do have the pressed signal available and we can connect it to whoever wants to handle rerolling, right? So again, this will be something orchestrated on a higher level. we will connect later on to the reroll button's press signal somewhere else to handle the actual rerolling of the units. Why do you think we want to do this on a higher level? Well, because if we want to do it here, then we would need to have access to a bunch of stuff. For example, the unit cards, right? Because we want to spawn new unit cards to that VBucks container we'll have when we reroll the units. But do we really want to do this from the button? Not really. I think it makes sense to do this on a higher level, namely in the shop level, right? So we have our shop scene, which has everything related to the shop. So it's much cleaner to say that the shop has the responsibility to connect those two different pieces together, pressing the reroll button and spawning new unit cards when this happens, right? But since we already do have access to the player stats, what we can do is when we press it, we can subtract that 2 gold, right? Because we have access to the player stats either way, right? Because we need to know if we have to disable the button or not. Hope that makes sense. So that's it for now. We can save this with Control S. And if we go back to 2D view and want to test this, we can select the reroll button, the root node, go to the inspector tab. And if we scroll all the way up, we should have a new export variable for the player stats resource, and we can just quick load it to have access to it. And just to make it a bit easier to test, I'll click on the player stats resource itself and set the starting goal to something like, I don't know, 5 maybe. And if we run the scene, I can click on the reroll button once, twice, and then it becomes disabled and sort of semi-transparent. I cannot click on it anymore because I only have 1 gold remaining, right? Pretty straightforward stuff. And once we're convinced that it works, we can set the starting gold back to 50 in the player stats resource and save the scene again with Control S. So the next thing we want to do is the XP and level tracker piece of UI, but in order to do that, we need to make some changes to the player stats resource first. So let's go to the script tab, press Ctrl-Alt-O and search for playerstats.gd. So we need to keep track the amount of XP needed for a specific level. So the easiest way to do this is to create a small dictionary like this one, call it XP requirements or something like that. And the keys will be the levels and the value will be the XP requirement to reach that level. So for example, if you reach level 7, in order to progress to level 8, you'll need 48 more XP, right? And in order to make this easier to ask what the current XP requirement is, we can create a new method which tells us. So if we scroll down, before the setter methods, we can do something like this. So we'll call this method getCurrentXPRequirement. It returns an integer, the amount of XP we need. And we'll just grab this dictionary we created and take the current level and add +1 to that. So we'll know how much XP we need for the next level. Right? If we're at level 6 currently, then level will be 6, and the get current XP requirement will return 36 because level +1 is 7, and this dictionary with the key 7 contains the value 36. Pretty straightforward stuff. Another thing we need to change is the setter function for the XP, because we need to handle leveling up. We didn't really do anything regards leveling up. We just provided a setter function that can set the level explicitly. But we don't really want that anymore, or that doesn't really do it anymore, right? Because, for example, if I'm at level 5 and when my XP goes above 10, then I should move on to level 6, right? So we'll handle this logic inside the setter function of the XP value, because this is where we need to handle this. It might happen that we need to level up. It even can happen that we need to level up multiple times, right? Because if I, for whatever reason, get like 50 XP at once, I might level up multiple times. So the first thing we do is we check if we are already at level 10, which is the level cap in the game. Because if we are, then we can return from the function immediately after setting the value and emitting the changed signal. But if we're not, we basically need to do a loop. First of all, we'll call this getCurrentXPRequirement method we just created to see how much XP we need for the next level. And while it's true that the current XP we have is greater than or equal to the XP requirement for the next level, we can add 1 to the current level, we can subtract that XP requirement from our current XP, and we can grab the requirement for the next level after making that level up, emit the changed signal, and repeat the whole process until we reach a level which we don't have enough XP for, right? So that's the logic we need here. And with these changes to the player stats resource, we can actually create that XP tracker we were talking about. So let's save this with Control S and move on to the UI part. And to create the tracker, click on the plus sign again to create a new scene. And let's go back to 2D view. And our XP tracker will be a VBucks container by default. So let's click on other node and search for VBucks container. Double click and rename this to XP tracker or something like that. Let's zoom in to see what's going on a bit better. And first of all, we can set a custom minimum size to this. So let's go to layout and custom minimum size. And I'll use 70 on the X and 28 on the Y. And since it's bigger than 28, let's go to transform and click on this arrow to reset the values. And you can see it shrinks a bit. Okay, it's not that complicated what we want to do here, fortunately. So first of all, let's create a progress bar for the XP. With the XP tracker root node selected, press Ctrl A and search for progress bar. And it can remain actually progress bar, but it looks a bit ugly by default. So we'll create our own custom style boxes for this. Let's uncheck show percentage, then zoom in a bit. Then let's set the value to something like 70 to see how it looks like partially filled. And we can also go to layout and set a custom minimum size on the Y to however tall we want this to be. I just use 8 pixels. And then we can design this however we want to. I just collapse the layout for now, go to theme overrides and styles. So this is where we can use the style boxes to fill our progress bar. So for the background, I'll just click on a new style box flat, click on that new resource, and I'll just use a fully black background color. And for the fill, I'll create a style box flat again, but I don't really like how we don't have a border if we do it like this. So let's click on this one again. And for the background color, I'll use this vibrant blue. And to make sure that it has some border, we can go to border width and you can pick whatever you like. I'll use 2 pixels on each side. And to make it look a bit nicer, we can use the same color under border that we use for the background. I'll just use the same black one. And we created this nice bordered effect for this progress bar. And if we go back and select the whole thing and collapse these style boxes, you can play around with the value to see how it looks like. And I kind of like. It's simplistic, but it looks nice. So we just leave the value at something like 60. But we do need to access this progress bar from code, right? Because we need to change it when the XP of the player changes. So let's right click on this and access it as a scene unique name. And with the root node selected again, we need to display some information under the progress bar. So press Ctrl A again. And this time we'll use an HBox container node because we want to have 2 labels next to each other. So if we press Ctrl A again, search for label. One will be the XP requirement and the XP we currently have. So we can test this with something like 99 out of 99. And you can see that this font is way too big for this one. So let's click on the label settings, use the other font we have. So under font and font, let's quick load our M5x7 font here. And I kind of like the white by default, but let's add a shadow so it looks a bit nicer. 2 pixels and we'll use this black value with a higher alpha. Yeah, something like that looks kind of nice, but this label and the progress bar are way too far apart, I think. So we can make this a bit more compact. So what we can do is we can select the XP tracker, which is the whole thing we have, set the alignment to center, for example, and under theme overrides and constants, we can set the separation to whatever we want it to. I just use 0 to make them nice and tight. Okay, so we have one of our labels. Let's double click and rename this to XP label, for example. And we can duplicate this, rename it by double clicking on it to something like level label. And this one will say level colon space 1 or something like that. And we can put them to the 2 sides of this HBox container. And to do this, we can use this little trick. So we will align this one, this label, to the right on the horizontal axis. And under layout and container sizing, we can fill this to make sure it fills all the available space inside that container. And now we kind of separated them apart inside that HBox container we have. Awesome. So if we select the XP tracker, this is what it looks like. If we zoom out a bit, and I'm kind of satisfied with that. So before we actually jump into coding, let's select the 2 label nodes and right click on them and access them as scene unique names as well. So it's easier to change them from code. Right. So we can press Ctrl S to save this scene because it's still unsaved. Let's go back one folder, create a new folder, call this XP_tracker, and XPTracker.tscn is perfectly fine. click on save. Basically, we're finished with all the setup we need. So we can select the root node, the XPTracker node, click on the attach script button, xptracker.gd is fine, and we can click on create. So what we have here is pretty straightforward stuff. First of all, we'll provide a custom class name called XPTracker. Then we'll have an export variable to the PlayerStats resource because we need to have access to the information of the current XP of the player for this to work. Then we'll grab 3 already variable references to the progress bar and the 2 labels we just created. Then inside the ready callback, we do the usual thing, which is connecting to the PlayerStats changed signal with our own callback method. And we call it once as well to make sure that it immediately updates according to the data we have. Then inside that callback method is where the real logic lies. So we need to differentiate between 2 cases, right? Either the player is under the maximum level cap. So if the level is less than 10, we'll call a custom method called setXPBarValues. But if it's not less than 10, it means that we already reached the level cap. So we'll call a different method called setMaxLevelValues. Then either way, we need to update the level labels text. And we'll use the same kind of formatting we already have as a placeholder. So we'll just type in level colon space and we'll have a string placeholder. And for that placeholder, we use the PlayerStats resources level property. So what about these 2 methods? So when we already have the max level, we don't really have XP requirements anymore, right? So for the XP label, which displays our current XP and the amount we need for the next level, we just replace the whole thing with max in caps. So we know that we don't really need XP anymore. And we can set the progress bar's value to 100% so it's fully filled, indicating that we are at the maximum. That's the easier one. So what about this other case when we didn't reach the level cap yet? In this case, what we want to do first is we grab the current XP requirements from the PlayerStats resource. And you might notice that I've used a float here instead of an integer. Why? The XP requirement is not a value with a fraction, right? See, the problem is to set the progress bar's value, we need to divide the current XP we have with the XP requirement and multiply it by 100. And the issue is that both the XP and the XP requirement are integers. And in GoldScript, when you divide 2 integers, the result will be an integer as well. And that's a problem because let's say you divide 3 by 10. For example. So 3 divided by 10 should be 0.3, right? Which is then multiplied with 100 and it equals to 30%. It checks out. Well, yes, but if you divide 2 integers, so if you divide 3 by 10, then in GoldScript, the result will be an integer as well. So it will be 0 instead of 0.3. And that's a problem because it would say 0% instead of 30. So what we do is we convert either of these values to a float, because if one of the numbers for that divide operation is a float, then the result will be a float as well. So we'll have fractions. That's why we need to convert this into a float. And when we have that, then we can set the XP labels text with 2 placeholders and the slash between them, just like we did with the mockup. And in the place of the first placeholder, we'll use the XP. And for the second placeholder, we'll use the XP requirement we have. And then we can finally set the progress bar's value. So we'll use the formula we were talking about, which is a simple % calculation. Right. And that's it for the script. We can save this with Control S, and we might want to test this thing, right? So we don't really have a way to get XP as of now. So what we can do is we can include some testing code. And right now I just override the input virtual method. And when we press the UI accept, which is enter by default, we'll just add 4 XP to the player. Okay, so now we have some testing code to see how this looks like. Let's save it with Control S. Go back to 2D view, because let's not forget that if we scroll all the way up, the XPTracker has an export variable for the PlayerStats resource. So we can just quick load this. And now if we save the scene and run it with F6 or clicking on this button, so you'll see that we do have a problem because we are already at level 2 and we shouldn't be. Because if I click on the PlayerStats resource here, oh, that's right, I left it at level 2. So we might not have a problem after all. I just kind of messed this resource up. So let's set it back, make sure that it's at level 1. Again, if I click on this, okay, it's at level 1, save everything with Control S and run this scene again. Okay, so it seems like it wasn't a bug, but it was a mess up on my side. Okay, so we are at level 1, we have 0 XP, and the XP needed for the next level is 2. It checks out. If I press enter, I should get 4 XP, which means if we go back to the script of the player stats, if we take a look at our XP requirements, it means that if I press enter, I should be at level 3 because I immediately have 2 level ups. And indeed I do, right? Because for level 2 we needed 2 XP, and for level 3 we needed 2 XP as well. So when I press enter and edit 4, I leveled up 2 times. If I press enter again, you'll see the progress bar working. I have 4 XP out of 6. If I press enter, I level up again. And everything seems to be working as intended. I can keep spamming enter. And if we arrive at level 9, what happens is we get an error message. Okay, so we definitely do have a bug, right? So what happened here? We can just investigate. So we started from the input callback, and that's right because I pressed enter and set the XP to a bigger number. Then we go to the setter function, and we have this while loop to check the current XP requirement. And when we tried to grab the current XP requirement, we were at level 10, right? You can check the member variable here. And when we wanted to grab that XP requirement, level plus 1 equals to 11. And if we scroll up to the dictionary, then it happens to be the case that we don't have a level 11 requirement. So we do have an error in our code. How can we handle this? So if we go back here, you'll see the problem is that we have a while loop because it might happen that we get more XP than 4 at a time. And even if we just get 4 XP at a time, you saw that from level 1, we immediately go to level 3. So it's completely fine that we have this while loop because we need to loop through multiple times if we want to add more XP. But we run into this problem of being stuck in that loop when we reach level 10. And we have this safeguard here to make sure that when we're level 10, we don't do any of this. But the problem is that we were not level 10 when we started this. When the setter function was called, we were at level 9, right? So we grab the XP requirement for level 10 and we start this loop. So what we can do is we can make sure that we break out from this loop when we reach level 10 and we don't try to get the XP requirement if we reach the level cap. So we need to make 2 changes here. First of all, for this while loop, we need to provide an additional layer of protection by saying that while the level is less than 10 and the XP is greater than or equal the XP requirement. So when we reach level 10, we for sure break out from this loop because the level will no longer be less than the level cap. But this doesn't really solve our problem yet because, again, when we entered this for the first time, when we added the last 4 XP, we were at level 9. So this won't stop this error from happening. But what we can do is we can make sure that we only update this XP requirement value when we do have one. So we can do 2 things. Either implement the logic here, which I don't really like, because this looks concise on its own. We could do an if statement and only do this if the level is not equal to 10 or less than 10. But I think we can handle this inside the method itself. So this becomes clean because it would kind of pollute the logic of this. I think this set XP method would become much harder to read if we were to do this check right here. So what we can do is we can press and hold Control, click on this one. And before returning that value, we can either do an if statement or we can just say that we create a variable called next level, and this will be equal to a clamped value. So we'll clamp level plus 1 between 1 and 10, basically, right? And what clamp does is it makes sure that no matter what calculation comes out from level plus 1, it will be between 1 and 10. So if this would be 11, then it becomes 10. That's what this clamp function does. And then we can just use this next level as the key for our dictionary, right? So this way we for sure don't get an error message, and it won't be a problem that it will say 76 for level 11 because this is just to make sure that we don't get an error message. The setter function will take care of not changing the level value because we have this one right here. Right? This is why we added this safeguard. So when we enter at level 9, we add 1 to the level be equal to 10. We subtract the XP requirement from the current XP, and we'll grab the next one, which will be the same 76. We won't get an error message anymore, but it doesn't really matter because after we emitted the change signal, we go back to the while loop, and since level be equal to 10 now, we'll break out from this while loop. And no matter what happens to the XP, we won't reach this part of the code again because this safeguard will make sure that if it changes and we are already at level 10, nothing happens. Hope that makes sense. So if we save this with Control S and run the scene again, everything should work as it did before. So if I press enter, I can start leveling up. And hopefully when I reach the end of level 9, what happens is we go to the maximum level, right? And if I keep pressing enter, nothing really happens inside that progress tracker because we already reached the level cap. So we have this max text and level 10 and the progress bar full. Awesome. With a lot of the work done, we only have one final piece of UI we need to create before assembling everything together. So let's click on the plus sign one last time to create a new scene. Go back to 2D view, and this won't be a complicated one. We just need a button to buy XP as well. So let's click on other node, and our root node will be a button. Let's double click and rename this to XPButton. And let's zoom in a bit to see what's going on better. And again, we only have an icon and a text we can use. So we'll use a custom build solution to design our button. And we'll use a VBucks container as a base. So let's press Ctrl A. Search for VBucks container, and let's set the sizes to make sure that everything is as big as we want it to be. The XP button itself, if we go to Control and Layout, will be 30 by 30 pixels, and the VBucks container can fill the whole thing. So if we select it, go to Anchor Presets and set it to full rect. Awesome. Inside that VBucks container, the first thing we'll add with Control A or clicking the plus sign is a label node. So let's search for label. Let's rename this to XP label or something like that to stay organized. And what we'll say is plus XP or something like that. Make sure to center it. And again, I use the smaller font to make sure that we have enough space for everything. So click on the label settings, create a new one. We can quick load the font. If you repeat it this many times, we might want to save this label settings as a resource to make it easier to reuse. The reason why I didn't do it is because if you want to design something differently for this specific label, then you can do this if it has a unique resource attached to it. But if you want this to be uniform, I definitely wouldn't do it one by one always, right? So you can always click on this arrow and press save or save it as a resource inside your file system, and you can keep reusing it. But for now, we'll just create that label settings, and we'll use not an outline, but a shadow again, just to make it pop a bit. Something like this looks fine. And then we can do the bottom part, which will be a label and the gold icon next to each other. So select the VBucks container, press Ctrl A to add a new child node, and this time we'll use an HBucks container to make sure that the label and the icon will be next to each other. Again, we can do a custom scene for this, but what I just do is I go to the Reroll Button scene and select the gold icon, press Ctrl C to copy it, go back to our unsaved scene, press Ctrl V to paste it, and we can just duplicate this XP label and drag and drop it under the HBucks container, and make sure that it's actually before the icon, because that's how I want to structure this, and set the text to 4, right? So it was quick and easy. We can rename this to gold label, and to make it look a lot nicer, we can make sure that this HBucks container centers its content like so. So we're basically done, but it looks a bit ugly still. So what we can do is we can select the VBucks container, go to theme overrides and constants, and set the separation to 0 or any value you like. I kind of like them being closer to each other like this. And I think that looks all right, but the button itself could do a little bit of a facelift. So let's select the XP button, go to theme overrides and styles. And remember, we have these prepared for us. So let's set the pressed, the normal, and the hover versions of these style boxes. And for the focus, again, we can turn it off, or we can use an empty style box for the focused state. Right, so this is how the XP button looks like. I think it's fine, but I also don't really like the gap between the gold and the text. So let's select the HBucks container too and set the separation value to something smaller, maybe 2 pixels. Yeah, I think it looks nicer if they're close to each other. So this is how the button looks like. We don't really need any scene unique names because we don't really want to change anything with this. So let's just press Ctrl S to save this. Go back a folder, create a new folder, call this XP_button, and XPButton.tscn is fine. Okay, with this saved, we can create the script for this one before putting everything together. So select the XP button, the root node, click on the attach script button. XPButton.gd is fine. click on create. And before jumping into the coding part, let's connect the XP button's pressed signal to itself. So with the XP button node selected, let's go to node, signals, and double click on the pressed signal and connect it to ourselves. And this script will be pretty straightforward too. First of all, we'll provide a custom class name called XPButton. Then we'll have an export variable to the PlayerStats resource to make sure that we know how much gold the player currently has. Then we'll use an already variable reference to the VBucks container. Again, the reason why is because we want to set the modulate property if we cannot afford to buy XP. Then in the ready callback, we do the usual thing, which is connecting the PlayerStats resources changed signal to our own callback method and calling it once. So what do we do when the player stats change? Well, two things can happen. We cannot buy XP if A, we don't have enough gold, or B, if we are already at level 10. So we set the disabled property of the button based on this. If we don't have enough gold or we reached level 10 already, then we'll disable the button. And we set the modulation to communicate this visually as well to the player. So we'll use a fully opaque if the player has enough gold and not yet reached level 10. Otherwise, we set it to a semi-transparent, a 50% transparent value. What about when we click on the button and buy some XP? Well, this is pretty straightforward stuff. We subtract 4 gold from the player and add 4 XP instead. So that's all we really need. It's like 20 lines of code, so we can save this with Control S. But again, the way I structured this episode is I wanted to show you that we don't even have anything set up in the shop, and the shop doesn't even exist inside the arena yet. So the way you want to do your game development ideally is that you can test everything in isolation, right? So we have the XP tracker, so we could test this inside the shop where both the button and the tracker will be available, but we want to make sure that this works and we can test it on its own. The only thing we really need to do here to test this on its own is some print statements when we press the button. See, if we press the button, our gold, our level, and XP might change, right? So with these 3 print statements, we can make sure that it works on its own, and we don't even need to instantiate it inside the shop yet. So let's go back to 2D view, because we do need one more thing before testing it. And that is going to the inspector tab and scrolling all the way up, you'll see that the XP button now needs to have access to the player stats resource. And you guessed it, we can just quick load it from our file system. And now with the player stats resource assigned, we can finally test this. So we can run this scene by clicking on the button or pressing F6. And we have the XP button and it's enabled. We can use it, we can hover over it, and if I click on it, you can see that the gold is subtracted and the level and the XP updates accordingly. So if I start spam clicking this button, we can go all the way to level 6 with 8 XP and our gold becomes 2. And the button becomes disabled, and if I click on it, nothing happens. Awesome, so our XP button works as intended. If we're sure that it works, we can get rid of the testing code. So one final thing to do is we can go back to script, and inside our onPressed callback method, we can delete all these print statements. Save the script with Control S, and that wraps up creating all the individual pieces. What's left to do is to assemble them together. And to do so, we can go back to 2D view and basically close all these scenes. We can right click on the first one, the gold display, and we have these close tabs to the right. And then close this one as well. So now we have our empty shop basically with the top and bottom parts created. So we can start putting everything together. So in the top part, we'll have the gold display first. So we can click on the Instantiate Child Scene button or press Ctrl-Shift-A and search for GoldDisplay.tscn and add that to the mix. Now with the top selected again, next to the gold display, we want to have the unit cards, right? So for those, we want to create a VBucks container so they will be displayed under each other vertically. So press Ctrl-A and add a new VBucks container. And we can actually rename this by double clicking on it and call it something like shop cards, something like that. And we actually need to have access to this inside our code later on. So we can right click on it and access it as a scene unique name. And then kind of just to test how this works, we can instantiate again by pressing Ctrl-Shift-A or clicking on that button, a couple of unit cards. So search for UnitCard.tscn and we can press Ctrl-D to duplicate it 4 times. And you can already see it's starting to look like what we had in the demo. So that's basically the top part done. If you want to, you can change the separation between these two or between the different cards, but I kind of like how tight and compact it looks like right now. So I'll just leave it as is. And now we can do the bottom part. So for the bottom part, we want to press Ctrl-Shift-A again to instantiate our XP button first. So this will be on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we want one final VBucks container where we have the Reroll button and the XPTracker under each other. So with the bottom container selected, press Ctrl-A, add a VBucks container, and double click on it, and we can rename this to something like Reroll and XPTracker if we want to keep everything organized. And we want to instantiate two child scenes under this. So press Ctrl-Shift-A, search for Reroll button, click on that new container again, press Ctrl-Shift-A, and search for XPTracker.tscn. And you can already see it kind of looks like what we had in the demo, but we do need to change a couple of things to make it look a bit nicer. First of all, the XP button is a bit too big, right? Because it's inside that container. You see the height of the content is this, and by default, this XP button will fill that height, but we actually want to override this. So let's go to layout and container sizing, and instead of filling all the vertical space we have, we can use shrink end, and this will put it to the bottom, but not smaller than the minimum size we set for the button, which is perfect. As for the reroll button, it looks fine to me, but I don't really like how everything is the same width right here. So I don't think that the XP tracker should be this wide. I think we can make this a bit smaller. And in order to do so, we need to do the same. So we set the minimum size to 70 pixels for this one, but if you take a look at the transform, it fills all the horizontal space and it's 80 pixels wide. So what we can do with the XP tracker selected, go to container sizing, and instead of filling all the horizontal space, we can shrink it towards the end. And you'll see we sort of give some breathing room for this container, right? And if you want to, we can also put some space between those, right? Like, I don't know, I kind of want a bigger gap between the XP tracker and the reroll button. So let's just go to theme overrides and set the separation to 8 pixels maybe. I kind of like how we have some space now. Maybe that's too much. Let's use 7 pixels. And also, we can use some more space between the unit cards and this whole bottom part. So to do this, select the shop itself, the root node. And you remember we have two child nodes, right? The top part and the bottom part. So we want to increase the space between these two. So if we select the shop and go to theme overrides and constants, again, we can change the separation to something bigger. And we can use like 10 pixels here to give some breathing room. I think that looks fine. The final thing I want to change is making sure that it's not all the way to the edge of the screen, this whole thing, right? With the shop node selected, we can press W to go into move mode and turn off grid snapping. And we can just start dragging and provide some space. I'll use like maybe 8 pixels on both axes. If we go back to selection mode by pressing Q, we can turn back the grid. It looks a bit nicer because remember this blue line is the end of the screen, right? It's the resolution we have for our display. So I think it looks nice. If we save the shop scene and run it to see how it looks like, you get a much better feel what we'll get. And I kind of like this, but as I try to test it, you already see one problem appearing. When I hover over one of these unit cards, all of them get highlighted, which is super weird, right? And we'll come back to this in a second. But as far as the layout goes, I'm kind of happy with that. So what we need to do is we need to hook up some things inside the shop, namely rerolling. Because if you remember our whole thing, the XP button handles itself because it subtracts the golds and adds the XP. The XP tracker is working on its own because it only needs the player stats. The gold display works. Unit cards will work. You know, they emit this signal when a unit is bought. And we have this reroll button, and the only thing that it does right now, if we press it, is it subtracts 2 gold, but we don't really have any other information appearing, right? That we should reroll the units. And you already see this weird thing happening, right? When I start to reroll and the width of this gold display changes, you'll see these icons kind of jump around. And this is definitely not something that we should enable because it looks super weird and buggy. So we have two issues we need to fix, and we need to hook up the reroll button. Let's start with hooking up the reroll button, and we'll fix the issues after that, right? So let's select the shop, our root node here. We can expand all the nodes so we see everything we have, and click on attach script, and shop.gd is perfectly fine. Let's click on create. So the script will be pretty simple for now. First of all, we'll provide a custom class name called shop. Then we'll have our own signal called UnitBot, which will have the same signature and the same name we already had for UnitCards. And this is what I mean by bubbling up signals. Since we don't have an event bus we rely on, we have to find another way to make sure that the arena can orchestrate this connection. So when we click on a unit card inside our shop, we want the arena to connect this event to the unit spawner's spawn unit method, right? And it's definitely not a good idea to directly try to connect the arena to one unit card because they are really far away from each other. And we want the arena to be this high level node which is only responsible for the highest level things happening inside the game. So what we do is we take the unit card's unit bot signal, re-emit the same thing, but from the shop this time, because the arena can have a direct connection to the shop as it's a very high level thing inside the game. Then we also have an export variable for the player stats. We won't need it for now. We're just sort of setting up the next episode where we will do some more advanced stuff like the unit pools and the actual rerolling and things like that. And we also need an already variable reference to that VBucks container which holds all the shop cards we have, all the unit cards. Why do we need those? Well, because in order to test the whole thing, what we do is we loop through all the unit cards we have inside that VBucks container in the ready callback, and we connect our own onUnitBot callback method to that signal. And what do we want to do when a unit card emits that UnitBot signal? Well, we want to re-emit that signal, but our own UnitBot signal this time, right? So this is what we mean by bubbling up signals. First, the unit cards emits when it recognizes that it's been clicked on. Then we connect to that event and say that we sort of forward. It's like forwarding an email, if that makes sense. We just re-emit the same signal we defined in our own class, so the arena can be notified later on. And in terms of rerolling, since we won't address that in this episode but the next one, for now what we'll do is just print out a debug message that, okay, this is where the unit rerolling should be happening, right? Because the reroll button itself just subtracts the 2 gold from the player, but at least we'll have a print message saying that this is where it should happen, right? Those are all the scripts we need for now. I wouldn't even say need, it's just mostly prep work for the next episode. Probably this is the most important one, to make sure that you have this connection in your head that we want to do the rerolling somewhere else, not inside the buttons script. Okay, so let's save this with Control S and let's go back to 2D view. And now that we added this to the shop, this script, we can click on the shop and make sure that we assign the PlayerStats resource. We won't need it for now, but we should assign it so that we don't forget to do it next time. Okay, so now if we save the scene, we only have those 2 issues remaining, right? One of those issues is when I start to reroll, the whole UI is jumping around like crazy. I mean the top part. Also, we can see that the code is working because if I spam click rerolling units, we get the print debug message every time. But everything else kind of works, right? So disabling the units if we don't have enough gold works. Disabling the XP works as well. The XP tracker shows us everything and I can reroll, right? So if I have 0 gold, I can't really do anything else. So let's solve this issue of jumping around like crazy. So the reason why it happens is because this isn't a monospace font. And if we select the GoldDisplay instance we have here and click on this open in editor icon, you'll see that we set the size of this HBox container to 28 by 18 pixels. But the problem is it's not always that size. That's one part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is that it works in isolation, but it doesn't really work with a container parent. Because if I select the GoldDisplay inside the shop scene and go to transform, you'll see that actually the size property is disabled and I can't really edit it because the node is a child node of a container. So its actual size will be set by the parent container, not the node itself in the case of container ancestors or children. So what we can do is we can set a custom minimum size to make sure that it's at least this wide. Because otherwise, what happens is when I change the goal to something like 9, see the goal display can be resized to a smaller value. If I click on this, you'll see now it's just 21 pixels wide because it no longer needs that 28. We can sort of circumvent this by saying that, okay, we have this 28 by 18 pixels and set the custom minimum size to be the same value. And now we sort of guarantee that it will be at least this wide. So if we save the scene, go back to the shop and run it again, we'll know for sure that this will be at least 28 pixels wide. But see, the jumping around still happens, interestingly. But if I go to 1-digit gold values, it works. So if we go back to the gold display, why do we still jump around? Well, the reason why is because since this is not a monospace font, 28 is just not enough. So if I set this to something like 44, which is a wider number, I think, you'll see that the actual size changes to 30 and that custom minimum size of 28 is no longer enough. So just to be sure that we have enough space, we can set the size and the minimum size to 32, so a full tile wide by default. And if you don't really want anything to jump around, one thing I also changed, but I forgot to record it, is the alignment of this node container. See, if we put it to the beginning, then this gold icon will jump around because if I change this to 1-digit, see, it sort of pops back. And I think what looks the nicest here is to set the alignment towards the end of the whole container. And this way, when I change this to 4 from 44, you'll see that only the label sort of jumps around and the gold icon remains the same. So I think that looks perfectly fine. And make sure that we have a big enough minimum size set to this container. And if we save this and go back to the shop, you'll see that it's wider by default than it's supposed to be. Like we still have a couple extra pixels to spare. But this is just to make sure that when we run the shop scene, no matter what value we have, the jumping around no longer happens. What changes is only the label, and I don't think that's a problem anymore. So I think that solves our problem pretty well. And that's one thing, but if we run the scene again, we still have that other problem is when I hover over one of the unit cards, all of them change into the hovering state. So what's the reason behind that? So first of all, let's open up the unit card, right? Click on this open in editor icon again. And we need to select the border node here because that's what changes, right? So when I change the border color to something else, that's what changes when I hover over the unit. And what we change here really is a resource. So this style box flat we just created here is an embedded resource inside our scene. And the way resources work in Godot by default is that they are shared. So when we have 5 unit cards and all 5 of those unit cards use this style box flat resource, it will be only loaded to the memory once. And this actually saves a lot of computation space and performance, right? Because they share the same thing. They all have this style box flat panel with the border width and the color given. And by default in Godot, we say that when you use a resource and reference it, it will be the same for all instances. And that's a problem here because that means that if I hover over the third unit and change the border color to the hovering one, all of them will change because they essentially share and reference the same resource, right? Hope that makes sense. So when we go back to this and expand the resource category, we'll have this checkbox here called local to scene. Let's see what the documentation says. If true, the resource is duplicated for each instance of all scenes using it. At runtime, the resource can be modified in one scene without affecting other instances. Cool. So this is exactly what we want here, because what this means is that all of these instances will have the same border, the same values, the 2 pixels on each side and this green color by default. But this is sort of just a starting point because then each of those instances will have a duplicate resource of this one. So then each of those can be changed individually. So just with this one checkbox ticked, when we save the scene and run the shop again, it should fix this small little problem we had, right? Because before we only had one Stylebox flat resource, and all 5 of these unit cards used the same Stylebox flat resource. But now we have 5 of the same copied and assigned to each and every one of them. So when we change the hover color for one, it only changes that one specific resource. Pretty cool, huh? So now we fixed everything with our shop. And there's just one final thing we need to do, and that's actually hooking up the shop inside the arena, because we did this in isolation. And fortunately for us, this will be pretty simple. So let's select the arena scene. If it's not open, you can just press Ctrl-Shift-O and search for arena.tscn. And just to keep things tidy and organized, I right-click on this and say Close Other Tabs. And you'll see that the right-hand side is pretty empty for now. So what we can do is we can select our root node, the arena node, click on the plus sign or press Ctrl-A, and add a new canvas layer to make sure that the whole UI is on a different rendering layer inside our game world. We can double click and rename this canvas layer to something like UI. And under that canvas layer, we can click on the Instantiate Child Scene button or press Ctrl-Shift-A. And the final thing we need to do is just instantiate our shop scene, and voila, it immediately appears on our screen, and we added the whole shop UI to our arena. Let's save the scene with Ctrl-S, and if we run the game, you see I can combine the things we had. So I can start dragging and dropping units, I can sell them to the sell portal. This gives 4 gold to me, which is immediately visible inside our UI. We can still swap units around, and we can interact with the UI the same way we did in separation. So I can buy units in quotation marks because they don't get spawned yet, but that's what we'll address in the next episode. So I think that's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.